I wish you a very good day, everybody. I am Professor Dr. Elham Hossain, and today I like to tell you about Chaucer. Why do we call Chaucer the father of English poetry and English language? Actually, before Chaucer, if we go back to the Anglo-Saxon period, then we find that English literature, especially if we explore the manuscripts of Beowulf or the Seafarer, then we find that these poems are about the chivalric people, the people who belong to the upper class of the society. They were not commoners. They were totally different from the ordinary people or the average people, and they enjoyed a special status in the society. So these people occupied the canvas of Anglo-Saxon poetry. In Beowulf, we find Beowulf as the protagonist of this epic. And this very Beowulf is not an ordinary person. He is a man from the Geats or Jutes. He fought against Grendel. He killed Grendel, this sea monster. He also killed Grendel's mother. And ultimately, he became the king. And he governed the country with great pomp and prestige and great success for 50 years. And after 50 years, he fought against a fire-breathing dragon. He killed this dragon and he sacrificed his own life for the sake of his country. So thus we find that this Beowulf is not an ordinary person. And this very epic is a glorification of this very man. And if we go to Seafarer, we find the picture of the glorification of heroism, the picture of the glorification of the navigators and the people who used to take up adventurous expedition in the sea. And they were not ordinary people. So we do not find the presence of ordinary people or the people living in the margins of the society in the canvas of Anglo-Saxon poetry. And if we come to the Norman age, the Norman conquest, we know that it occurred in 1066. The Norman king, William the Conqueror, came to England and he killed King Harold, and he became the king of England. And with the Norman conquest, Norman literature, especially the literary traditions and elements brought with them by the Normans, occupied the canvas of English literature. Suppose romance, then the stories of spirits and supernatural spirits were imported by the Normans. And even the ballad form was also imported by the Normans. And Norman language, that is the French language, became the language of the people in administration. And during the time of the Norman regime, Norman language was the language of the people in power. And the scholarly people used to speak in Latin language because Latin was the language of international correspondence at that time. And Latin was also the language of knowledge. So Latin was the language of the scholars. And only the average people used to speak Anglo-Saxon language. And Anglo-Saxon language did not find any place, any significant place in English literature, especially composed or produced in Norman period. Now, if we come to Chaucer, who was born in 1340, and he died in 1400. So Chaucer belonged to 14th century. And during the time, the Anglo-Saxon language was mostly used by the people living in mid-England, and they were all average people. And Chaucer used their language as the language of literature, and he produced literature. He composed general prologue to the Canterbury Tales. He also composed 24 tales. He composed Troilus and Cressida. So Chaucer discovered the treasure of the language of the common people. That is, the language that we find with Chaucer was the language of the average people. And before Chaucer, it did not get any prestige or honor in English literature. And Chaucer was the first who discovered that the language of the common people could be the language of English literature. And ultimately, the language that was used by Chaucer in his writings has become the base, has become the foundation of English language and the language of English literature. And Chaucer discovered the flexibility, gravity, and levity of the language of the common people. And he discovered that this language of the common people could be a very fit choice for composing literature. Actually, this is the reason for which Chaucer is called also the father of English language, because he discovered the treasure, he discovered the power, he discovered the ability of English language. Another important thing that we find with Chaucer, and for which we call Chaucer special, is that Chaucer's use of the common people in the canvas of English literature. As I have already told, before Chaucer, English literature did not give any significant space to the common people in the canvas of English literature. English literature was dedicated to the glorification of the chivalric people. But Chaucer was the first who brought the common people to the canvas of literature. If we go to prologue to the Canterbury Tales, we find there 30 persons from different sections of the society, from top to the bottom of the society. And we know that every society is stratified, or we find stratifications in the society. Every society is compartmentalized. Every society is divided into different classes. We find their upper class, we find lower class, we find middle class, we find clergy people, we find nobility, we also find the commoners. Every society, even today, we find it, even in capitalistic society, we find classes. So Chaucer brought the characters from different sections and different stratifications or different classes of the society. And all the characters that we find in general prologue to the Canterbury Tales are the representative characters. These characters represent the classes from which they come. Not only that, Chaucer has, through these characters, depicted the real pictures or the realities in which these characters were living. And here lies Chaucer's modernism also. Though Chaucer was born in 1340, though he used to write more than 600 years ago, even today, after 600 years, we find that Chaucer is a modern poet. So why? Because modernism lies in realism. And if we explore Chaucer's poems, we find that his poems are dedicated to the description, to the delineation, to the portrayal of the characters related to or involved in the realities of the society. So in this way, we find that Chaucer's characters are not the caricatures of flesh and blood. Chaucer's character are not cartoons, or Chaucer's characters are not robotic. Chaucer's characters are flesh and blood. They suffer, they become happy, they feel hungry, they also become angry. They are jealous of other people, they're also generous if necessary. So we find all the human characters in Chaucer's, and this is the reason for which John Dryden once declares in his preface to the fable about Chaucer that here is God's plenty. That is, we find God's plenty in Chaucer. And this is the reason for which Matthew Arnold has also declared that English poetry started its journey with Chaucer. So Chaucer is very much similar to our Rabindranath Tagore Bangla that we use today in our writings, or Bangla that we speak today, was produced by Rabindranath Tagore. So Tagore is not only a literature, not only a writer, but also a creator of language. Because the Bangla that we find before Tagore is not the Bangla that we speak today, that we write today. Suppose the Bangla of Bunkim or Bangla of Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, the Bangla of Ram Mohan Roy, is not the Bangla that we use today. The Bangla that we use today is the Bengali language produced by Rabindranath Tagore. Rabindranath created Bangla language, and at the same time, he has used this Bangla language in his composition of literary works. Similarly, we find the same particular characteristic in Chaucer. Chaucer has used the language of the common people. He showed the English that their language, that is the language of the common people, can be the language of literature. And ultimately, that very language has become the language of literature. Though every language goes through evolution, so the language that we find with Chaucer is now to us, or to our hand, through some evolutions. But the root of today's English is lying in the hand of Chaucer. And another important thing that I like to say that has distinguished Chaucer from his contemporary poets like Gower, Chaucer's attitude towards the people, especially common people, was really great or positive. If we think of Gower, who was a landlord, his attitude towards the common people was not quite humane. He possessed a kind of superstition for the ordinary people. In his eyes, the ordinary people who used to protest the whimsical activities of the rulers are not human beings. They are apes, they are dogs, or they are meaner kinds of animals. But if we peep into the writings of Chaucer, we find that Chaucer's characters are very much individual in their characteristic behavior, and at the same time, they represent their particular section from which they have come. Suppose the squire or squire's father, the knight, or suppose the prioress, a female character, or the wife of Bath, or the monk, or the friar, the Oxford scholar, the cook, the haberdasher, the miller. All these characters are very much free in their behavior. They are also distinct in their dress code. They are very much distinct in their disposition. And at the same time, they are the representative characters of the class from which they have come. So here we find that Chaucer has exhibited his greatness in the portrayal of the characters. He is not superstitious, or who does not possess any kind of biasness towards his characters. His characters are free, they are individual, and at the same time, they are representatives of their classes. So thus we find that Chaucer is really special. And this is the reason for which we call Chaucer the father of English language and father of English poetry. And last of all, I just like to mention another point, that Chaucer's use of humor has made him special also. Chaucer is very critical towards his characters. He does not leave any stone unturned, lashing his whip of satire on the back of the deformities of the society. He has criticized the characters who are corrupted. He is very, very brave to criticize these characters, even the institution, very powerful institution, for example, the church, which was unethically exercising its unjust authority or hegemony upon the people, was also criticized by Chaucer. But Chaucer does not transform himself into a propagandist. Chaucer is an artist thoroughly. So how? Chaucer is an artist by using some features or devices or strategies of literature, and use of humor, use of irony, and other poetic qualities have enabled Chaucer to become an artist. Chaucer knows that he is not a propagandist, or he is not an activist to bring about a revolutionary change in the society, but he thinks that he's a critic of the society. He has the power to diagnose the diseases of the society. And while doing this job, he has adopted some literary techniques or devices. For example, humor, for example, irony, for example, the use of different rhetorical devices or ornaments of language. And in this way, we find that Chaucer has become completely or absolutely a poet and artist. And this is the reason for which Chaucer has become a towering personality in English literature. And we call Chaucer the father of English poetry, and even the father of English language. So I think this is all about today's lecture, and I'd like to meet you with further discussion on Chaucer's prologue and his Non's-Free State. And I will also deliver my lecture on Troilus and Cressida in future. So no more today. Thank you very much. And my thanks and gratitude to you to be with me. Goodbye.